Ja. Gerne. Exactly. All right, as you settle in, I want to wish you very welcome. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our after-lunch panel discussion, What Liberalism Has to Tell Us Today. My name is Alexander Schwitteck. I'm project coordinator at the Center for Liberal Modernity, and I will be the moderator for this session. And I think for some time now, it's commonplace to claim that liberalism, liberal democracy, is in crisis. It is increasingly under scrutiny for its supposed shortcomings. On the left, many insist that liberalism is exhausted and a dying bourgeois ideology and unable to handle the problems posed by social and economic inequalities, environmental destruction, and the rise of authoritarianism. On the right, it has been argued that liberalism is responsible for the breakdown of virtue, the collapse of traditional values, and the nuclear family, of course. This criticism, this critique, is anything but new. However, poses the question by many, is liberalism even worth saving? And what are we saving when we're speaking of defending it? We as liberals must ask ourselves, what has liberalism to tell us today? So, and to help us navigate this discussion and do some real, liberal soul searching, so to say, I want to introduce my experts on this panel. First of all, to my left, Karen Horn. She teaches history of economic thought and journalism at the University of Erfurt. Very welcome. And to my right, we have Michael Zürn. He is the director at the WCB Berlin Social Center and professor of international relations at the Freie Universität. Very welcome to you too. Then we have Eva Atanassow. She's professor at the Bard College here in Berlin. Very welcome. And finally, Stefan Kolev. He's the academic director of the Ludwig Erhard-Forum, and he's a professor of political economy at the University of Zwickau. Very welcome to you too. So given our tight schedule and time constraints, I wish to directly start into discussion, and afterward we'll open the floor for some questions from the audience. So I wish to start with liberalism historical trajectory and its perceived crisis. And my first question to Stefan Kolev. For some time now, it seems that conservatives like the political theorist Patrick Deneen argue that liberalism has failed because it succeeded. it actually undermines itself through its own contradictions. So, Professor Kolev, Stefan Kolev, what do you think about this idea that perhaps liberalism's success has become its own gravedigger?
So let me first start by thanking for having me, but not just for having me, but also to LibMod for hosting the conference here. As Ludwig Erhard-Forum, we also host here our event, Zivilisierte Provokation here. Ralf Fuchs was already a guest. And I find this important because we are at Pariser Platz. This is one of the most historic places of all European places, with all the tragedies of the 20th century. So I do believe it's crucial that we meet here and not anywhere in Berlin. So thank you for doing it here. And thanks to the Allianz-Forum, Michel Schmitz, who is the director of the Allianz-Forum, a wonderful economist, by the way, is great in hosting events like that. Alex, thank you for the question. Well, first of all, about Patrick Deneen. Right before I came to Berlin 2 years ago, I spent 6 months at Princeton in a conservative Catholic bubble called the James Madison Program. I'm neither conservative nor Catholic, but it was an amazingly stimulating experience. And my boss in the 6 months, Robbie George, is actually the teacher of Patrick Deneen. So it was very interesting to talk to those people about Deneen and about those new enemies, adversaries of liberalism. And by the way, they do believe that he is derailed. So even his bubble is very skeptical. I would like to start with something which has been on my mind for quite some time, and in the beautiful volume of Ralf Fuchs and Reinhard Mante on renewing liberalism, I have a tiny, and the volume is back there, I have a tiny essay about what neoliberalism could mean. As you know, this is not just in Germany, but actually everywhere in the world, including in Bulgaria, where I'm from, a terrible word. Neoliberal is like the proxy for all evil happening around us. And I'm a member of the FDP, so I'm part of the political evil as well. But I think there are 3 interesting ways how we can think of neoliberalism, and I think that's a nice intro to our conversation. The first usual definition of neoliberalism is that it happened in the 1930s. The news network, which Karen Horn founded jointly with myself in 2015, organized in 2018 a conference in Tübingen where Ralf was the proxy for Walter Lippmann. Because in the Walter Lippmann colloquium in 1938 in Paris, that term neoliberalism popped up, and usually you would read that that is when neoliberalism was born. But that is not true, as I will show in a minute. The second usual meaning of the word is what I just mentioned, neoliberalism as turbo-capitalism, as social Darwinism, as FDP, so evil, okay? What I would like to propose is a third definition, and I'm very happy that Alan is with us today. We had him on a joint event in November here in Berlin, and he's a good friend. And this is my own definition of neoliberalism. I see the history of liberalism starting from, let's say, Smith and Kant. So 2 years ago we had 300 years of Smith. Last year we had 300 years of Immanuel Kant. I see the history of liberalism as a sequence of neoliberalisms, okay? So any person we remember in the history of liberalism, and we have forgotten quite a few, and some of them rightly so, right? But the ones we remember were neoliberals. Why? Because they have contributed something new to the doctrine of neoliberalism as it was at their time. Otherwise, we would forget them, right? So if they had not been innovators to this living idea or doctrine of liberalism, they wouldn't have contributed anything and they would be forgotten, like many, many, many liberal thinkers are forgotten. So, for example, Adam Smith is a neoliberal compared to John Locke. John Stuart Mill is a neoliberal compared to Smith and Locke, etc., right? So Wilhelm von Humboldt was a neoliberal compared to Kant and Smith and all that. So, right, anybody we remember was an innovator in the history of liberalism, and that is why I believe, and with that I would like to end, that is why I believe neoliberalism is an interesting term. Because of the Elon Musk debate we have right now, Sabine Döring is in the audience, is very active on that on Twitter. We have this debate, what is classical liberalism, what is libertarianism, are there some differences? I don't like the word classical liberalism, and I propose to my fellow neoliberals, we have somebody from Norway who organized a meeting of the Mont Pelerin Society among us today. I propose to them that we call ourselves neoliberals and not classical liberalism, not classical liberals. Why? Because when you call something classical, what you basically do is you put it on a pedestal and you start praying to this wise thing which has to be emulated and imitated. I don't like that. This creates sects, cults, and this is not good, especially not for young people. In contrast, neoliberalism, as I defined it in the third definition, has something progressive, right? Because it basically says we today are the next neoliberal generation. We have to innovate compared to what was in the 20th century, the neoliberalisms before us, because our times are different and we have to translate this fantastic treasure trove, also Schatztruhe, of liberal ideas to our times which are specific. And that's why I believe neoliberalism is not as evil as we usually say.
Thank you. Thank you, Stefan. Karen, if you may follow up on that, if you share the idea of that Stefan lined out, that liberalism itself is always reinventing itself, does the past then even offer something we should look into? Or does it mean look at where we are right now and go from there? Do we really need the past?
Oh, definitely. I think we do need to do both. We need to look at the past and rediscover what was out there and what could be useful again today. Lessons that we've perhaps forgotten a bit, and it begins with Adam Smith, whom you've already quoted, who did not neglect the moral sphere, which is why Alan also has him in his book. I think that is one aspect that maybe we need to rediscover, and we can rediscover it from scratch, but we can also rediscover it by reading the classics, so that's always helpful. But I do also think that we have to adapt to challenges of our days, which requires, as a first step, that we diagnose properly what the problems of the current times are. And I think populism is really the elephant in the room, so let's start with that. That's a good battle to fight, I think. Liberalism, like many ideologies, I would think, is a body of thought that has to adapt, and it has adapted. And Alan has shown us how it has adapted according to the fears that either liberals, self-defined liberals, had, or society at large. And I think that that's a good way to start. And I don't think that it means that we have to dismiss what was there earlier. We just need to pick old stuff and think about new stuff. And as we do that, the one thing we may never forget is what is the soul of liberalism, what stands at the core, at the heart of liberalism. And as the word says, it is liberty, of course. And then we have to have these debates again. What does liberty mean? Is it only individual liberty, or weren't there thinkers that have taught us that individuals can only live their liberty as part of the groups that they're a part of, their families, their friends, their wider circles, perhaps also their cultural realms, their country, whatever. If we neglect that, we end up somewhere where liberalism doesn't have much to say. It becomes sterile, I think. So that is one thing. If we rediscover this personal freedom, individual liberty within the group, considering the person with his or her connections to others, with the connections to the body, the political body that we evolve in, the empowerment that requires, the rules that requires for the political process, the construction and the structure of the political process and the government bodies. Well, the field becomes very large, but it's clear from where it starts. And I think that that's a good starting point. It may lead us according to the situation that we are in, into different directions. And that's, I think, the strength of liberalism. It has a clear moral basis, and from there we can start and try and tackle the questions that come up and that are pressing today. I have many grievances with liberalism as I've experienced it over the last 10 or 20 years, and I think there is a lot of work to do. There is the political realm to rediscover, there is the function of the state to rediscover, there is groups in civil society to rediscover, all of that, but it's not as if we really start from scratch. You can always find things in the history of ideas, and then for the rest, use your own brain.
Thank you very much, Karen. Professor Zürn, if I may ask you, as you're working also on the strengths and weaknesses of liberalism, what do you make out of that? What do you think is worth saving if we speak about liberalism? What is at the heart, as Karen Horn mentioned, of liberalism in your view?
Yeah, thank you. As you said, we in the excellence cluster contestations of the liberal script, we are mainly asking what kind of weaknesses are responsible for this tide of challenge that we currently observe, and are these challenges really related to the weaknesses of liberalism? Therefore, your question here, what liberalism has to tell us today, is a challenge, because we need to think what needs to be defended. And I thought about it and came up with 4 things, and I mainly only list them, and then maybe we can go on in the debate. I mean, the first one, given the challenge of populism, I think it's worth to repeat what has been said already this morning by Jan Zelonka. Democracy is not the rule of the majority. It requires basic rights, it requires civil rights, political rights, the freedom of public media, and many other things. It may be possible that there are other forms than liberal democracy, but no democracy can live without these liberal components. So that would be the first message, essentially, against populism. Against polarization, and there I'm probably a little bit in contradiction to your wonderful talk this morning. I probably would say at this point, and after citing Jan Zelonka, I cite now Dwight D. Eisenhower, who is supposedly said, the United States of America are based on a firm belief in religion. It does not matter which religion it is. And in that sense, I mean, ethical pluralism seems to be a very, very strong element of liberalism. And that seems to me still a message, given the age of polarization, given the sort of intolerance that arises. So I probably would go with the argument that many of the parties within a liberal system should be more based on a strong belief system and on a strong ethical belief system, but the political system as such is built on ethical pluralism. That would, and I think any good political system should be built on that. So that would be the second message. Against the post-truth world, let me just say, and here I cite Daniel Moynihan, everyone has the right for its own opinion, but not for its own facts. And that essentially brings in a third point, that besides this ethical pluralism, it is built on a little rest of universalism. And that has also something to do with the acceptance of facts and truth and the epistemology that is associated with these facts and truths. And that would be something third that I would say liberalism has still to tell us today. And the fourth one is, here I'm probably talking a little bit about neoliberalism and all that. I mean, it is obviously true that liberalism is related and has some affinity with markets, some affinity even with capitalism. So it produces, undeniably, inequality. But then again, I think liberalism tells us that there's an upper limit of equality, and that is when it affects the equality of opportunities. And that means essentially when we enter an age, and we are currently in very many respects entering an age in which there is no equal access to education, no equal access to health, no equal access to similar life chances, then it is too much inequality. And in that sense, I would say the fourth thing that liberalism has to tell us today is that there are upper limits of inequality that can be accepted morally, but more importantly, that are essentially, that need to be recognized if you want to have a society that is considered as legitimate, or a political system that is considered as legitimate. So that would be the four ones that I would identify as the ones still to stick on.
Thank you very much, Professor Zürn. Eva Atanassow, may I ask you, and I want to perhaps come back to the criticism leveled against liberalism for some time now. And I asked before, has liberalism perhaps itself become its own gravedigger, as many of its successes perhaps, lead to certain crises, or at least that's the argument of many who criticize liberalism these days.
Thank you. I also want to start with a round of thanks to LibMod for this wonderful conference. And it's not a usual thing for an academic to be in the presence of journalists and people from civil society. I think this is exactly the kind of thing we need for thinking fruitfully about the challenges ahead. I also want to thank the morning panels, as a result of which I'm having a total brainstorm. So Constanze Stelzenmüller said if she was incoherent, it was because of jet lag. If I'm incoherent, it's because so much is going on in my head. But coming back to your question, critique and self-critique. Yeah, that's a good thing. I'm no fan of Patrick Deneen, but I think the idea that liberalism failed because of success rings totally true to me. In both objective and subjective sense. Objectively, because liberalism, contrary to what it preaches, which was pluralism, became hegemonic. And hegemony is not a good place for anybody, as we liberals know. And that hegemony, I think, is partly the source of the kind of backlash that we are seeing today. Subjectively, I think, liberals ran themselves into this place with ideas like the end of history, which of course was a critical thesis, but nobody noticed the criticism. Everybody embraced the prophecy. And so we've been living in a world for the past decades that believe, it's going to be all liberalism. We're all liberals now, but that turned out not to be the case. And so it seems to me the critical thing to be done is to pedal back both from the end of history and from hegemonic aspirations. And that's actually more challenging than it seems. So if maybe I can lead the way after Professor Zahn by questioning just about everything he said. So first of all, is it true that there is no democracy without liberalism? Well, historically, it has been true. Democracy is older than liberalism. And there have been democracies without liberalism. So obviously that's possible. Is it desirable is the question. And there are strong voices out there which say not only is it desirable, and Deneen is one, but it's necessary. We need to think our way beyond liberalism. Again, I don't want to endorse this, but as a matter of possibility, I think it's important to take notice that yes, it is probably not impossible. Secondly, pluralism, that's something we continue to insist on, even though that's probably just about the most difficult thing to do, is to deal with diversity, right? I mean, part of what the populist challenge is a diversity in the public sphere in which all the liberal verities are being contested to a degree that we're unprepared for. So pluralism is a challenge. And I also want to say pluralism is absolutely inherently a liberal value, but it's not the only liberal value. And if I'm allowed to quote the seal of the United States, it's e pluribus unum, right? So one thing a liberal polity requires is the capacity to create unity out of plurality and not simply dissipate into aimless factionalism. That's actually quite difficult, as the Federalists, as the American founders and the European founders knew very well. So pluralism, yes, but unity also. And maybe connected to that, Kerstin Kohlenberg kept repeating in the morning panel, patriotism, that's a value you liberals need to come back to. Patriotism, there was no taker for that, so let me take that up. Not only patriotism, I would want to say nationalism is something that liberals want to take, and I look at my teacher and friend and what is it, a partner in pleasant disagreements, Alan Kahan, right? So nationalism is precisely what liberalism needs to rethink ASAP, because nationalism is on the banner of these so-called populists, and they're having a monopoly on an idea that obviously has a lot of public traction. So unless liberals come back to their roots and think their way into how to make an argument for national unity that is based on pluralism, but is not losing itself in pluralism. How can we unite plurality into one capacious democratic polity? Then I think the liberal cause will be lost.
Thank you, Eva, for this. Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the case of democracy again and liberalism. We already touched upon that this morning, and you brought in nationalism. We haven't talked about at all yet. So, if I may, Professor Zürn, do you want to directly react to the statement made by Professor Atanassow?
Sure, but I mean, regarding the first one, I don't think it's worth now to go too deeply into it, because it depends very much on the question how you define democracy, and then we can have those discussions about how to define democracy. But if it is that free people should have a possibility to have a say for those decisions that affect their freedom and their life, then I think those sort of basic political and civil rights should be a necessary part of it. That is maybe sort of a normative argument, but I would also argue I have problems to see how this definition was essentially put into practice without an acceptance of those basic civil and political rights. My major point essentially is on this pluralism thing. I mean, while I do agree with you that most liberal societies still are far away from being really plural, there are many elements of discrimination and relationships of dominance built in. There is no way to deny this in a sort of a descriptive sense. But when it comes to the question, what essentially creates the current crisis of liberalism, I really would have problems to say this is the major reason, given that what we experienced in the last 2 or 3 decades is, of course, an enormous push towards more tolerance to different lifestyles. And many of those who act now against the liberal order are essentially those who think we have gone too far in that respect. I mean, not that I'm saying this, not at all, but if we make now this sort of causal argument about this causal relationship, I have problems to accept essentially this argument that it is the lack of pluralism, the lack of acceptance of different lifestyles and ethical positions that are responsible for the rise of the authoritarian populists. There I would say maybe it's the other way around. I mean, unfortunately, don't get me wrong.
Thank you. Stefan Kolev, please.
So let me first thank Eva for bringing it up. Let me say with a smiley that, of course, LibMod has a long tradition of having Eastern Europeans in that crowd, but I think it's a premiere to have 50% of speakers being from Bulgaria. So beware that there might be a cartel of opinions here. But it is important. Yes, you are cornered. It's eine Ketzelschlacht. So, I'm from the FDP, as I mentioned. So, Eva brought something extremely important, and we don't know each other that well. My educated guess is that she did so because she and I grew up in Bulgaria of the 90s, which was a terrible place when it comes to debates, to discovering pluralism, but in a very, let's say, in a very barbaric manner, right? And so I'm super grateful that you brought you up. A friend of mine and myself, Niels Goldschmidt, who, by the way, is the new director of the Weltethos Institute in Tübingen, we wrote a tiny booklet last year called 75 Years of Social Market Economy in 7.5 chapters. It's a tiny book at Herder. And what we try to do is to show that the social market economy, and I don't have to say that because I direct the Ludwig Erhard-Forum, but because I think it's essential for our time. The social market economy is all about compromises. And I'll explain what I mean. I think in the public debate, we focus too much on consensus. Consensus and pluralism is either super difficult or impossible. We can perhaps have consensus on very, very abstract things, but not more. In contrast, I think we really need to rediscover the power of compromises. And the social market economy, from its very inception in the late 40s, is all about compromises. There is a fantastic piece which I recommend to anybody in the room. It's very well readable, by Alfred Müller-Achmach, the guy who coined the term social market economy in 1946-47. It's a piece in 1950 in das Weltwirtschaftliche Archiv, which until today is the journal of the Kiel Institute of Economics. And it's called Soziale Irenik, so the ironic formula of basically agreement, harmony, and all of that, like Irene, like the goddess of peace and harmony in Greece. And these social ironics in the social market economy, from its very inception, is fundamental for back then and for today, for what Eva brought up. Why? Imagine the society of West Germany in 1950. Millions of Nazis, socialists, communists, conservatives, reactionaries, a few liberals. Terrible place in terms of polarization. Terrible place in terms of material inequality. You have people who still have a house by chance because they were not bombed out. Then you have somebody who has a piece of land, even though the house was bombed out. And then you have somebody who just arrived from the eastern provinces, from Pomerania, or from Silesia, or from Prussia, and has a horse. Okay, so that's an inequality of a very serious type. And then those guys, Ludwig Erhard, Müller-Achmach, Walter Reuken, come up with the idea, well, Weimar should not repeat itself, that's obvious, but how do we get there? We get there by inventing something which is called an ironic formula, a formula for finding compromises. Compromises do not mean, by the way, that we forget our differences. We keep the differences. We have differences, we sit at a table, round or not round, that doesn't matter. We agree on something, and then we leave the room and our differences still persist, they're still there. But for the moment, and that was, by the way, my hope for the Ampelkoalition, of which for quite a long time I was a great fan, that despite all the differences of those three parties, they could have found compromises, even though the difference of the three parties persist. And so let me conclude by saying that what is called the economic miracle in Germany was not a miracle in the sense that it was simple economics. Good money and free prices. That's easy peasy for economists. But there was a miracle. And it was a twofold miracle, but it had nothing to do with economics. Miracle number one, so I call it das doppelte Versöhnungswunder, so the double reconciliation miracle. Miracle number one, this society which I just described, materially and ideationally totally polarized. Only 10 years later, in the late 50s, Godesberger program of the SPD and all of that, found peace with each other and became something like a society, which it certainly was not in the late 40s. It was a piece of polarized, today we would say echo chambers, bubbles, or whatever. 10 years later, only 10 years, it became a society. And by the way, because we are a European format here, in 1957, when the European communities were founded, the first, how is it called, president of the first European Commission, something like that, was a German, Walter Hallstein, part of that gang, by the way. 10 years after World War II, not only Europe unites in this wonderful construction of the European communities, but they put a German lawyer, who, by the way, was not very clean in terms of his past during the war, as a head of the European Commission. Now, this is harmony. So that's reconciliation miracle number one. We need it urgently today. Reconciliation miracle number two, the Germans found their peace with capitalism. Any Western society is anti-capitalistic, any. There are different reasons for that. Our first annual conference of the Ludwig Erhard-Forum last year, here in the Bundesbank in Berlin, was about anti-capitalisms in various countries. Any Western society is anti-capitalistic. And the work of liberals to reconcile people with the market economy is always a Sisyphus type of a job. The stone always comes back. But in the first 20 years after the war, and we urgently need that after the next elections in February, in the first 20 years, Ludwig Erhard, and I have to say that, reconciled the Germans with capitalism. How did he do that? Well, first of all, with using that coinage, social market economy, which is a nice term. This is also what our parents in Bulgaria wanted after 1990. And second, by going for 20 years to the marketplaces in West Germany and talking to people. Erhard hated his office because he really preferred to talking to people. And that's what I would really recommend to all politicians in Germany of any kind, but especially liberal politicians. Liberalism is a difficult thing. It has a lot of rational and rationalistic elements. We need to talk to people. That's why, by the way, on Saturday, I'm doing some campaigning in Zwickau on the streets with my friends.
Thank you, Stefan. Thank you. Karin Horn, if I may ask you, perhaps in its first part of Stefan Kolev's answer, he sketched out the virtue of compromise, moderation, perhaps. Is that something of a meta-virtue of liberalism, perhaps, that liberalism has to tell us today? Or is this too vague to really be such a thing?
I like that term. Thanks for bringing that up. Moderation, I think, is a core value, but it is an individual value. It's an individual ethical command. And it is something that suits a liberal very well, I think, because I see it that at the core of liberalism stands the respect one has for others. Liberals believe that everybody is of the same value for different reasons. Some find the origin of this belief in religion, others find it in natural law, whatever, but it's pretty much the foundation of Western thought beginning with the ancient Greeks, to conceive of the other as somebody who has the same value. And you find that, of course, very largely expanded upon in the work of Adam Smith. If you believe that, if the other has the same worth as you have to respect that person and listen to that person's concerns, and that requires a certain technique when you get into a conversation with a person. If you have a viewpoint that differs slightly from that of the other, or starkly from that of the other, well, you better pronounce your views in a moderate way, not so as to shock that person away and end the conversation. I think moderation has to do with how we treat others. That is one thing. It's a technique of persuasion also. And it is an expression of humility. And I think that liberals ought to be humble, because we don't know it all. We don't have an answer to everything. That's precisely why liberalism has to revamp itself regularly and find new answers to new and pressing questions. Challenges change, people change, the world changes, we need to adapt, and we try to put in all our scientific knowledge that we have to come up with better solutions, reread the classics to come up with solutions that were there but were unused. But who are we to know that we have the really good answers? So we should be moderate also in proposing our solutions and trying to convince, but without being presumptuous, without telling that the other's views are worthless. That's for me what moderation means. And there's an excellent book on that by Aurelian Coraiutu. Stefan knows him as well. Who looks at the history of thought and comes up with some examples of thinkers like Camus, like Aron and others, who have very nicely practiced this art. And I think we can learn a lot from that. I have friends who say that in this populist environment, with so many enemies out there, liberals have to raise their voice and be a little bit fierce too, and have to stand up and be loud. I don't believe in that. I think that we create more enemies, we betray our souls, because that's not how we want to look at the world and treat others, and that's not how we want to be treated. So I think there's a virtue, an attitude of humility that moderation embodies and that liberalism should adopt.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, I mean, what are the strategies ahead for us liberals, right? I mean, Eva, maybe you can come into about that, because I think Jan Werner Müller calls some of our contemporary liberals mea culpa liberals, right? We are responsible for our own failure, perhaps. Many people tell that. So Eva, perhaps.
Well, speaking of mea culpas, Michael Ignatieff published a long version of it the other day at Washington Post. And while I strongly believe in the need and the value of soul searching, I'm not entirely sure one should do it in public. But I also very much believe, and this is maybe the Eastern versus Western Europeans here on this panel and maybe in the audience, that the West has gone far too far in its taking blame and blaming itself, not noticing that a lot of the intellectual foundations of this blaming actually come from hostile places, and the best evidence of this was Putin's annexation speech, which is basically a rosary of post-colonial proposals. So the West needs to, and liberal democracies need to be clear. And again, I started on a critical note about their failures, but they also should be aware that, you know, they're in a fight. And when you fight, you need to be strategic and smart, and not simply confessional. But moderation. So in reviewing Aurelian's book, I was struck by the opening of it, which was basically admitting that moderation is not a magnetic idea. You don't go to the marketplace and say, oh, let's be moderate, everybody, because the young are not going to be impressed. And the book, actually, the book is structured as an attempt to talk to young people, and as far as I read the book, it's a failure, right, to talk to young people. The young people are not, and I also see it in my classes, if I put liberalism in my class, it's a guaranteed I won't have students. So maybe there is another way. And what is the way forward? It seems to me that liberalism needs to reconnect to another core value of itself, and that's competition. Right? It needs to become competitive in the political sphere, the way it teaches competition in the economic sphere. And that means basically understanding what is it out there in the marketplace of ideas that is currently, for whatever reason, magnetic, and address that. As I said, for me, it seems to me that nationalism and the question, what is it that makes us a community, whether it's a community of Germans, Bulgarians, notoriously difficult case, right, or who have you, whatever, right? What is it that makes us? Why are we living together? What is it that we have in common? What should be the sort of grounding of our shared identity? It seems to me that's a current idea in urgent need for liberals to take up. And that maybe add one more sentence, liberalism usually is talked about, and that was the case in the morning panel as well, as an individualist creed. But that, again, historically has not been the case. Liberalism has a case for a communal way, right? A modus vivendi, which means a way of being together. And that's an aspect that maybe, again, needs revisited and updated.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Eva. Stefan Kolev, really quick point, and then please, Michael Zürn, you have the final words before the audience. Thank you.
Very quickly, 3 very brief points. Point number 1. Yes, liberalism has made mistakes. which in a certain sense is trivial, because as we know since Immanuel Kant, people are made of crooked timber, krummem Holz. Liberals are people, so it would be very surprising if liberals had not made mistakes being made of crooked timber, okay? But please don't be too apologetic, and that's what Eva said. When I ran for the Saxon Landtag in 2019, which is not a great job, by the way, I had on my flyer the claim, we live in the best of all historical worlds. And I firmly believe in that. This is materially true. We have never had a world with so little poverty. And this is ideationally true. We have never had a world where so many people globally have access to liberty and justice. So don't be too apologetic, please. We live in a fantastic world and we need to defend it. Point number 2, radicalism and extremism. I would really like to distinguish those two categories as I understand them, and I'm simply an economist, so forget my ignorance in terms of political theory. I believe the center has to be radical, because I always imagine radical as being something vertical. So we have the political spectrum, and any part of it has to be radical in the sense that we need to go down to the root of the problem we're talking about. We do not have to be extreme, though, which means extremism to me is not a vertical but a horizontal concept and a rhetorical concept which is related to the language we talk. So please be radical in the sense that we search for solutions to solve our big problems out there, both in the economy and in society, but avoid extremist language. Third, and very briefly, I would like to touch upon, because it's an elephant in the room for the people from Germany, on the debate about Millet and Musk and the chainsaw, the Kettensäge. As you can see, I'm not very good at handling those tools. I'm not a very practical person in any sense of the word. But when the debate started in the summer, I proposed in FAZ something which luckily has now become quite a metaphor in the whole debate. We do not need a chainsaw in Germany yet, and I hope that we don't get there. In Bulgaria and in Argentina, perhaps we need a chainsaw, but not in this country. And the chainsaw is a revolutionary tool, and liberals don't like revolutions for good reasons. But what I proposed in the summer, and what has become quite a common term in recent weeks, is something like the garden scissors, die Gartenschere, or if you prefer, but we have somebody, so Sabine Döring's husband is somebody who knows much more than that, Gartenschere or Heckenschere, okay? So we have some tool, and it's a big difference, because the chainsaw, as I said, is a revolutionary tool. After the chainsaw, there is nothing left. You erase the order of the garden. The garden scissors, instead of any type, is a reformist, piecemeal engineering in the Popperian sense tool, which cuts what is wrong, what we believe is wrong, then the garden rearranges, then the gardener, being the state, learns about these endogenous processes, how they work and how they don't work. So I do believe that the debate is helpful in the sense that it reminds us that our garden is not doing well, neither in Germany nor in Europe, and we need a reformist tool like the garden scissor, which has to be used very consistently with lots of courage, political courage, because otherwise the garden will be doing even worse.
Thank you, Stefan. Professor Zürn, I believe you would object to some of the points raised here. Perhaps you have the final words before we go into the question round. Thank you.
No objections. Two points only on moderation and compromise. On moderation, I mean, I agree with you that if you write the history of the Federal Republic of Germany from 1949 till the 1970s or something like this, you can write it as a story of success because of moderation to some extent. Later about compromises. I start with moderation. The point, however, is that from a certain point on, some people have called it post-democracy and stuff like that. Moderation has led to a situation in which it was extremely difficult to distinguish different parties and to see the difference and why there is political competition. And in that sense, there can be too much of moderation. And I would probably make the argument that it is the decline in difference between different political positions that should have competed with of each other, that this is one of the political reasons why we had the rise of people who push for much more radical positions. In that sense, moderation has its good sides, but it can go too far. On the other hand, I agree also very much with compromise, and that if we believe that a liberal system should be one that is open for different ethical positions and includes ethical pluralism, then of course at the end we need to have a compromise, because consensus is in that sense impossible. I mean, the idea of liberalism is not that it ends up with some worldview at the end of the day, and therefore it always needs to include compromises. But what I just observe, that of course the whole role of compromise becomes so complicated in an age in which authoritarian populism is already extremely strong. Then suddenly situation happens that you have to create coalitions between parties that are actually not really able to be a good coalition and to deliver the goods that you want to have. This is something you see in Germany, that you saw in Germany, that you see in France. I mean, the moment when the mainstream or the democratic parties get in terms of overall size so small that you have to produce coalitions that are very hard to produce effective policies, then there is a huge problem at all.
Okay, thank you very much to all of you. And now we would give you the chance to step into discussion. Please be precise and concise, and perhaps direct a question directly to one of our panelists. The microphone is up there. My colleague, Christina, is on her way, so please raise your hand if you want to.
Yeah, it's my question. Okay.
Perhaps
yeah, I was wondering...
Mister, you can stand up, then we can...
Yeah, okay. Can I have this? Thank you. Maximilian Priebe, University of Jena. I was wondering, my question concerns the statement that you made, Professor Atanassow. How would you think about the combination of nationalism and liberalism, as far as I understood? Because it seems at least a bit counterintuitive to me if we have, on the one hand, a movement that aims at diversity and plurality, to combine it with another movement that aims at homogeneity and unifying people. What is the value or the core point around which you would rally a nation in a liberal sense? Like I have difficulties in grasping what exactly you would propose.
Thank you. We are collecting as before, and then we make a final round with answers.
Thank you, though. Since I spoke earlier, I kind of feel embarrassed about speaking again. But I'd like to make one point in response to Eva about nationalism and another to Professor Zürn about facts. So nationalism first, in line with the question that you just had. I mean, look, it's easy for liberals to endorse the idea of a common culture alongside diverse subcultures. It's easy for us to endorse the notion of we need tribes, we need communities to bring people together. That's part of human nature. And I even understand the Eastern European point, which was once a German point, that to be free, first you need to have a state of Poland or a state of Ukraine or even a German state. But, and it's a big point, from a liberal perspective, salvation ultimately never comes from the state. We have to separate nationalism, which in some sense we may be able to endorse, from an utter commitment to the nation state, which to me has had historically some very illiberal consequences and is likely to in future. And then with regard to Professor Zürn, I think oddly enough we don't disagree where perhaps he thinks we do, and we do disagree where perhaps he thinks we're in agreement. And so I'll take this point about facts that Daniel Moynihan made, right? You're entitled to your opinions, but not to your facts. Try convincing a populist with facts. And populists are not unique in this. Try convincing a socialist with facts. Jonathan Haidt has formalized this as confirmation bias. Our opinions become our facts. This doesn't mean facts are useless, But the people whom facts convince are the people who've never made up their minds. And those are the people, effectively the young people, whom we have to present the facts to, because the old populists, facts are not going to convince them. Perhaps moral appeals will. That's part of my argument. But the facts themselves, not so much.
Thank you. I think we had one question up front here. Ms. Kolev.
Thank you. Maria Golubeva from Baltic Initiative on European Reform. A fascinating mention of compromise as a possible way forward, and it brought to mind really Robert Putnam's idea of bridging social capital, how you build it and how you can then agree about solving problems with people with whom you don't agree on other issues. But I'm just wondering, the example of Ampelkoalition you mentioned, it exactly showed that this kind of compromise breaks down when it comes to economic policy. So when you need more money in order to get people in less developed regions to be happy with their economic growth, and at the same time you need money to save Ukraine from one of the most illiberal powers that there is, you end up not agreeing on economic policy. So my question to all of you is, do you think it is at all possible to agree on economic issues that need to be solved? For example, the growing incredible inequality. It was mentioned before that Europeans have always been striving for valuing other people as themselves. I would completely disagree. I mean, we have lived with a state society for centuries and centuries, completely buying inequality as a factor of God's creation. So I think it's important to understand, do we actually have a way forward to agree on economic policy?
Thank you. Okay. I think we would take one last question. Two? One last. One last question, and then we may have a final round of the panelists. Please.
Yeah, well, I would jump in this debate about nationalism and liberalism, of course. And yeah, I do agree that Eastern European vision is a bit specific. But I would like to ask you, don't you think that basically liberalism forgot about certain ideas that then far-right nationalism took over? For example, the idea of national identity. Why don't we consider the idea of national identity as part of individual rights, for example, in the terms of rights discourse? And about nation-state, well, we need to accept that in certain regions of the world, and maybe even in most regions of the world, the state is the key and ultimate protector of rights. Because we do have this idea of international human rights, but unfortunately, there is so little, as we see right now, so little implementation forces that we are basically coming back to maybe pre-World War II idea that still nation-states are the best existing vehicles of ensuring liberal rights. Thank you.
Thank you. Please, Eva, as the issue of nationalism sparked some controversy, you have your final words, please.
Always happy to see a controversy sparked. I just wanted to endorse what Volodymyr Vermolenko just said. Yes, the nation state has been the one and only, so far, really format within which any workable idea of rights has been possible to exist. I mean, we can, of course, all agree that rights are universal in their foundation, moral equality of all human beings, and all that. But as a matter of citizens, we're not equal, right? I mean, Bulgarians equal to Germans? I wish. But so yes, as a supporter of the very idea of rights, we need the state. And now the question is, how do we support a state? And also, yes, to Alan, for state being something of a problem for liberals. Not necessarily an inherent problem. The founding liberals, the liberals of the American and the French Revolution, understood that only a strong and capacious state could defend rights and create viable economy and actually really enforce the rule of law, right? So all of these core liberal preconditions require the state. But the state is, the Leviathan is not only a solution, is the problem. And this gives me an opening for to introduce an idea that has made very prominent in a recent book, and that's the idea of dilemma. For me, liberalism needs to reconnect with its all dilemmatic core. Dilemmatic is not an English word, but I use it. And that is that there is no simply an idea that is clean, pure, and therefore untainted by any problems. So the same with national identity. Historically, national identity was a way to overcome the inequalities of caste and class, right? To become a citizen was a way from peasant, from citizen, what is it, from peasants to Frenchmen. There was a famous book on France historical sociology. So that was a way to overcome class distinctions. We're all equal as citizens, even though we are unequal in many other respects. So that, however, liberalism forgot and left behind because it wedded itself to this historicist, futuristic idea that we can leave behind national divisions, we can leave behind the nation states and arrive at the new era of post-national global whatever it is. Well, it seems to me that partly what we are asked now to revisit is that precisely that proposition. Is a global humanity united in one global whatever it is possible, or is it even desirable? My personal intuition is no and no. And in that sense, we may want to come back, as Francis Fukuyama has done, to the idea of the nation state and see whether, well, there is more there for liberals than we have thought.
Thank you very much. Karen, your final words, please. As you wish to comment on everything that comes to your mind, anything that comes to your mind on the issue. Questions,
anything
perhaps.
that comes to my mind. That's lovely. And if I may, I would pick up on the topic of our panel, which is what liberalism has to tell us today. We've talked a lot about history and about some pressing issues, but let me say once again that I think that there are certain things that stand at the core of liberalism, and that's people. Not people in the sense populists would use the term, but people as individuals with rights, with aspirations, with hopes, etc. If you use the chainsaw that was mentioned here, what you do is that you cut away everything, and that implies you cut away the institutions that have been evolving over centuries to ensure that individuals enjoy these essential basic liberties. So chainsaw is bad. That's I think clear. But what I sense when I talk to students at university or also to members of family is that what young people, if they're not somehow engaged in political parties, what they seem to be developing is a sort of anti-system mood. And when you have this anti-system mood, you call for the chainsaw. And that's so extremely dangerous. People are unhinged. They just reject everything. Deneen has been pitting liberalism, fascism, and communism, and he says that the two latter have died out. They're gone, so liberalism is the only thing that's left. Well, one could argue with that and say that conservatism and socialism are still there. But I don't think that that's what dominates the debate and the sentiment. People think that all of these ideologies have failed them, have not been successful. Everything is flawed. Presidents in the US have all been failures. Trump has been, of course, but Biden, many people have been unsatisfied with Biden's performance as well for good reasons, I think. The same in Germany. Look at the governments. I can't remember when we weren't complaining about their inefficiency and their not following what people had been voting for. This discontent feeds into a call for the chainsaw. And that's really bad. So we need to work in our institutions to make them more efficient, to make them work, cut down on bureaucracy. I don't know, there are so many things that need to be tackled, and I think that Stefan's call for compromise, or the ability to strike compromises, is very important, especially when you live in a country where government is formed by coalitions, where you fortunately don't have one big party that runs it all. But then you have to develop an ethos, you have to develop a style of moderation that allows you to strike compromises. And I think that's a call to our politicians that I would launch at this point. That's what liberalism tells you. Be ready to do this. Be ready to take good care of the institutions.
Thank you very much. Professor Zürn, please.
Thanks. Maybe first on equality, very briefly. The point that I wanted to make here is that we did a very broad study in 26 countries, including Eastern Europe, including Bulgaria, by the way. There was also this question, or based on the question, in what kind of environments do we see the rise of illiberal forces? And on the level of features of the society, there was one thing which was extremely important. It was not the distribution of private wealth or the unequal distribution of private wealth. That did not tell us very much about the rise of illiberal values. What it was essentially was a sense of the absence that there is equal access to the basic rights, to the basic needs, that there a sense that there is no equal access to public infrastructure, to health and education and stuff like that. And in that sense, the plea would be essentially, when we have those debates about inequality, to look a little bit less on the distribution of private health, but to look on a public infrastructure that is able to provide equal access to the basic needs and basic rights. So that is this issue on inequality. The second point, briefly on Professor Kahn, I mean, maybe we should go on because I'm also not really sure where we agree and where we disagree. My point here is, I think liberalism comes with a certain social epistemology. I mean, it's essentially laid down by Kant and the regulative idea of truth and so on. And what I increasingly see is a very systematic attempt of authoritarian populists to undermine the recognition within society of this liberal epistemology. I mean, sentences like flooding the public zone with shit, alternative facts, and all those things are not only statements about things that are not true, they are essentially strategies to undermine the liberal social epistemology. And I think as liberals, it's worth to define this, to defend this epistemology. That would be my point here.
Thank you. And please, Stefan, keep it short.
Yes, so the moderator is an old friend of mine, and I have to respect his wishes. So let me be very brief. First, to your question about economics, and thank you for asking it, because I firmly believe that economics is the scientific sister of liberalism, and we have talked too little about economics so far. Very briefly. And that connects to what you said before, that there can be too much moderation. And we had in this country too much moderation until a couple of years ago. Probably until the verdict of the Karlsruher Bundesverfassungsgericht in November 23, the center was way too homogeneous. When I talk to my students in Zwickau, which I do a lot, and thank you for mentioning Zwickau, by the way, they tell me, you try to convince us to vote for a party somewhere in the center, but it doesn't matter what that party is. And until a couple of years ago, that was not quite wrong. But luckily, and that's what I would like to reply to you, luckily this is changing. The debate I had here with Ralf was Ralf against Jens Spahn. And you could see that luckily, in the very last years, and that might be, by the way, the greatest merit of the Ampel. I wrote a review in FAZ this Monday of the book of Philippa Siegel-Glöckner, where you can read a little bit more about that. Luckily, we have again two halves of the center in terms of economic policy. We have finally, as in the Germany I entered in 1999, a center left and a center right. And this is wonderful, because if the center is too homogeneous, if there is too much compromise, I'll say it in German, hoping that you understand, because it's a little bit of a game of words. If there are no Spannungen within the center, if there are no tensions, the center is not spannend. Now that we have Spannungen, it is captivating to my students, and now they do care, seriously care, whom they should vote for in a month. What we had as a tragedy of the Ampel in the end, and by that you're right, is that in the end we had two center-left parties in terms of economic policy against a center-right party. And that killed the coalition. So that's why I hope that after the elections we get a coalition either of center-left parties only, or of center-right parties only, but not the mix which we had, because it would be a blockade again. Very briefly about patriotism. Very briefly. Yes. Yes, liberals are cosmopolitans, but we can also be patriots in a very simple sense. Wilhelm Röpke, who was one of that crowd of Erhard and Müller-Achmach, said that the nation state is too big and too large at the same time for quite a few things. And I agree with Eva that the nation state is important in terms of providing rights, in terms of providing social security. But it's too big when it comes to identity. And I firmly believe that we can be cosmopolitans in terms of identity and have our local patriotismus, in singular or plural, and this is combinable. So we have Gemeinschaft, in the words of Ferdinand Tönnies, and Gesellschaft, the cosmopolitan world society, that is combinable, but for that we don't need a nation state. One last sentence, Alex. There is a printout of this book, which came out just yesterday with the Greuter, a printout out of my printer last night, so you can browse it on the table back there. It's called Liberal Responses to Populism. And this connects to what Karen said about people unsubscribing from the system. In a working paper which is published at the Ludwig Erhard-Forum, I call it superfragility. Modernity has always been fragile, which is fine. We have always had crises, which is fine. But superfragility, and those are times like now, or the 1930s, or 1917 in Russia, are moments when people, normal people, stop subscribing to the center, start searching for alternatives, so there is demand for radical revolutionary alternatives. You get immediate supply of those alternatives, as we have it today, from the center left, from the far left and the far right. And then superfragility can kill the system. And that is why all of us, independent of the party politics we joke about in the last hour, all of us are guardians of that center, center left or center right, but we are guardians of the center, and we have to prevent this world from breaking in this context of superfragility. Thank you.
Stefan, thank you. Thank you again to our distinguished guests. And maybe we can continue the discussion via coffee now. See you to the next panel real soon.